Wythall Year, the filmed record of the activities of the Wythall Horticultural Society in 1971. Mr. White, who was our chairman for several years prior to his death, worked very hard to make his garden into a place of beauty. Here we see him working in the spring among the tulips and other flowers at the end of the garden. And here he is pruning a standard rose tree. Now we'll look at some of the gardens of members of the Society. Next door to Mr. and Mrs. White lives Mrs. Boyce. And here she is with Mr. White, admiring the flowers in the rock border. At this time of the year, we see aubrietia, tulips, daffodils, and primulas. Here are yellow auriculas in Miss Yeoman's garden. And here are the bulbs on Mrs. Shrimpton's terrace. Mrs. Shrimpton is a member who has just left us to go and live in Bournemouth. This shot shows how effective bulbs can be when planted in tubs. The tubs contain double yellow tulips and narcissi underplanted with forget-me-nots. Many of our members like growing shrubs, and azaleas are one of the finest for colour in the early part of the year. This specimen of Mr. Watts, Azalea praecox, is very beautiful, and the flowers show up well because they appear before the foliage. Here is Mr. Watt himself. And here he is with his wife and Mrs. Darby. Miss Hadley, who is a member of long standing, lives in King's Heath and has a garden where the shrubs are very well established. Here we see broom, tamarisk and azaleas. In Mrs. Darby's garden grows the flowering cherry Amanagawa, the poplar cherry, which is very suitable for a small garden, as its upright growth means that it takes up very little space and casts little shade. Mr. Pritchard, here sharpening his scythe, is going to clear some ground to plant a row of beans later in the year. It seems that he believes in letting ground lie fallow for a while. Mr. Watt has this ingenious device, which not only takes out a drill and sows the seed, but covers up the previous row. Here he is seen putting in some carrots. Mr. Watt is well known for the chrysanthemums which he grows in a great quantity. His ingenious frame for ensuring that the plants are correctly spaced was thought up and made by him. You will notice that he stands on a plank which prevents the soil from becoming compacted after it's been prepared. This is the beginning of a very long job, since Mr. Watt reckons to grow several hundreds of plants upon his plot every year. These are the same plants which we saw in the previous shot. Disbudding ensures that each plant gives one or two large blooms instead of a greater number of small ones. And here we see the range of colour which can be obtained in chrysanthemums, as well as different stages of growth, ensuring a succession of flowers over a period. Colchicums are not true members of the crocus family. They belong to a different species altogether, although the flowers are a crocus shape. This plant, often called the ice plant, is Sedum autumn joy. It flowers for quite a long period in the late summer and is very popular with all insects. It takes considerable skill to grow begonias as well as this. They are not easy plants to produce to perfection. And here we see Mrs. Watt's window box of mixed geraniums. Both species of Hoya have flowers of an unusual waxy texture, looking as though they've been carved. The scent is very rich and sweet. Most of us will recognise this shot of Mr. and Mrs. Dennis's lawn, since we usually pay them a visit at some time during the year. Even the best of gardeners can sometimes find a weed and then have a problem finding where to put it. Mrs. Davidson is a regular exhibitor of vegetables in our monthly displays, and also in our annual show. And here we see her leeks and parsnips growing in the garden. And now she shows us the onions, of which she is justly proud. At the time we visited Mr. and Mrs. Austen's garden, they were away on holiday, but kindly gave us permission to go in order to photograph the roses. As you can see, there was a very good display of these in 1971. Mr. Austen has a large collection of roses of many different varieties. As well as growing roses and chrysanthemums, Mr. Austen is also interested in sweet peas, but we were too late to see any of these. Mr. and Mrs. Pritchard are more members who have unfortunately left us. They have retired to Devonshire. While he was a member, Mr. Pritchard was especially fond of his dahlias, and always exhibited them, both at the monthly meetings and the annual show. Here we can see how effective a purely foliage garden can be, both in colour, shape and texture. Rear of the house, Mr. Davis has a much greater variety of plants. This ornamental cabbage is a very good plant for the flower arranger to grow. It has a wide variety of colour and is very easy to raise from seed. We shall miss our visits to Shorehurst Lane, particularly to the greenhouses, which contained many things of interest and were beautifully maintained by Mr. Davis. Here we see the interior of the greenhouse with its large selection of tropical plants. Mr. Davis grew many varieties of orchid, and we always enjoyed going to see these as well. Here are the herbaceous and rose borders planted around some old fruit trees which were growing in the garden. Mrs. Dennis is completing an arrangement in the candlestick. Note the toning shades of the foliage and flowers, which complement the bronze colour of the candlestick which is holding the arrangement. And this collection was made by Mr. Davis when the new Wythall bypass was being built. They are roots which were grubbed up when the hedges were taken out. most unlikely material can be used by the skilled flower arranger, and here he takes one of these pieces of dead wood and demonstrates with dahlias how it can be used as a basis for a flower arrangement. This is the completed arrangement. Notice how the line taken by the flowers follows the shape of the wood. Our annual show is the high spot of the year. It entails much work beforehand and on the day, but it gives us a great deal of satisfaction when all goes off well. And we see a sight like this in the hall of Wythall High School. We have many classes, and a good standard is obtained by all our exhibitors. Here we see a class for an arrangement in a basket. And here some prized dahlias. They won for their owner the bronze medal of the Dahlia Society. Each year we try to arrange an outing to a garden which will be of interest to the members. Tatton Park, which is in Cheshire near Knutsford, is noted for the rhododendrons which grow in the woodland gardens. These are well established and grow beautifully under the trees. But first, this example of a Victorian fern house is quite rare now. It contains New Zealand tree ferns. Mixed foliage and pot plants grow in a small greenhouse at the side. Here is a close-up of one of the rhododendrons for which Tatton Park is famous. This variety is called Sappho. And here is the azalea dell, planted round a pool with a fountain in the centre. The gardens at Hidcote Bartrim are only about an hour's drive from Birmingham, and well worth a visit. This is the part known as the Tank Garden, with its large, circular raised pool containing goldfish. Hidcote is made up of a series of small gardens separated by high hedges which afford protection from the wind. This flower is the blue Himalayan poppy. It's a beautiful shade of blue and has a lovely shape. And here is a very fine tree peony, one of a number which are growing in the garden called the Pillar Garden. The handkerchief tree, Davidia, was discovered in the mountains of northern China towards the end of the 19th century. And this beautiful avenue of Huntingdon elms has sadly been affected by the elm disease, and it is feared that it may not be possible to save it. When autumn comes, the berries begin to show colour, but even at the end of the year, gardeners must still look forward, for we are beginning to get out our bulb catalogues. In order to have bulbs for display in the house in the winter, it is necessary to plant early. I like to use a no-soil compost rather than fibre, because the nourishment it contains gives the bulbs something on which to grow and means that they are in good condition for planting in the garden later on when they've finished flowering in the house. Daffodils and narcissi in particular seem to benefit from a long period of growth, and the earlier in the autumn it is possible to plant them, the better they seem to do. And now, as we come towards the end of our film, I'll finish with a quotation from Arthur Clutton Brock. A garden cannot be bought outright like a diamond necklace and kept without further trouble. It is nothing unless its owner loves it and understands it. But if he does, then he can get as much pleasure out of it as of any amusement provided by the bounty of nature and the ingenuity of man.